The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the cracked pavement of the alley where Daniel knelt, his coat soaked through, his hands trembling as they cradled the face of the woman before him. Her eyes, wide with fear and something deeper, something like recognition, locked onto his. She was young, barely in her 20s, her thin frame shivering under a tattered jacket. In her arms, a small bundle stirred, a child no older than 2, whimpering against the cold. The street lamp above flickered, casting jagged shadows across her pale face, and for a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. Her voice, hoarse and broken, cut through the storm. "You don't know me," she whispered, "but I know you." Her words hit him like a blow, sharp and unyielding, and he staggered back, the world tilting beneath him. He didn't understand, not yet, but the weight of her gaze, the way her fingers clutched the child as if shielding it from him, told him this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a reckoning. The alley smelled of damp concrete and rotting trash, the kind of place where hope came to die. Daniel had been walking home from the diner he owned, a modest place that barely kept him afloat, when he'd heard her cry, a faint, desperate sound swallowed by the storm. He'd found her slumped against a dumpster, the child curled against her chest, and something in him had snapped. He wasn't a hero, not by any stretch. A single father at 38, he'd spent the last decade scraping by, raising his son Ethan alone after his wife walked out. He didn't have the luxury of playing savior. But the sight of her, so fragile and yet so fierce in her grip on that child, had pulled him in like a tide. He'd offered her his coat, his hand, a promise of warmth. And now, here they were, locked in a moment that felt like the edge of a cliff. "Why do you say that?" he asked, his voice rough, almost lost in the rain. "Why do you know me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her jacket, her fingers fumbling, and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was worn at the edges, the colors faded, but when she held it up, Daniel's heart stopped. The image was blurry, but he recognized the man in it instantly, himself, younger, smiling, his arm around a woman whose face was half torn away. His breath caught, a cold dread pooling in his chest. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice louder now, sharp with something close to panic. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears or rain or both, and said, "She told me you were my father." The word, father, hit him like a freight train. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the wet pavement, his mind racing to make sense of it. He had Ethan, his 10-year-old son, the only child he'd ever known. There was no one else, no other life he'd left behind. Or was there? His past wasn't clean, not by any means. Before Ethan, before the diner, there had been years of recklessness, nights he couldn't fully recall, faces that blurred together. But a daughter? No, it wasn't possible. And yet, the photograph in her hand, the one he hadn't seen in over a decade, was real. It was his. He'd kept it in a box under his bed, a relic of a life he'd tried to forget. How had it ended up here, in the hands of this stranger? "I don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "Who are you? Who's the woman in the picture?" She opened her mouth to speak, but a cough racked her body, harsh and painful, and the child in her arms began to cry. Daniel's instincts kicked in, pushing past the shock. "You're freezing," he said, stepping closer. "You can't stay out here. Come with me." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a lie. But then the child's cries grew louder, and she nodded, clutching the photograph tighter. He led her out of the alley, his arm steadying her as they walked through the storm toward the diner, its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. The questions burned in his throat, but he held them back. For now, she needed warmth, food, safety. The truth could wait, but not for long. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions. The place was empty, the last customers long gone, and Daniel flicked on the lights, casting a warm glow over the worn booths and checkered floor. He settled her in a corner booth, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she cradled the child, who had quieted now, her tiny face peeking out from the bundle. Daniel moved quickly, heating up soup and pouring hot tea, his hands steady even as his mind churned. Who was she? How could she know him? And that photograph, God, that photograph. It was a ghost from a life he'd buried, a life before Ethan, before everything had fallen apart. She ate in silence, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if expecting someone to burst in. Daniel sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly on the table, trying to keep his voice calm. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Clara." The name didn't spark any recognition, but it felt heavy, like it carried a story he wasn't ready to hear. "And her?" he nodded toward the child. Clara's lips softened, just for a moment. "Lily." He nodded, filing the names away, his mind still grappling with the impossible. "Clara," he said carefully, "that picture. You said it's me. You said. I'm your father. I need you to explain." Her hands tightened around the mug of tea, her knuckles white. "I don't know everything," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "My mother, she didn't tell me much. Just that you were someone important. Someone who left." She reached into her jacket again, pulling out a small, tarnished locket. When she opened it, Daniel's breath caught. Inside was a tiny photo of a woman, her face familiar in a way that made his chest ache. It was Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman who'd walked out on him and Ethan without a word. But this picture was older, from a time before they'd married, when she'd been vibrant, full of life. "This is her," Clara said. "She gave me this locket. Told me to find you." Daniel's hands shook as he took the locket, his fingers tracing the worn edges. Sarah. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't heard from her since she left. He'd assumed she'd moved on, started a new life. But a daughter? His mind reeled, trying to piece it together. "When were you born?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Clara's eyes met his, unflinching. 22 years ago. The math hit him hard. 22 years. He'd been with Sarah then, in the chaotic years before Ethan, when their relationship had been a whirlwind of passion and mistakes. Could it be true? Could he have had a daughter all this time, one he'd never known? "I don't remember," he said, his voice raw. "I don't remember you. I don't remember any of this." Clara's face hardened, just for a moment, but then her shoulders sagged, exhaustion overtaking her. "I didn't expect you to," she said. She didn't either. She wanted me to find you. Before her voice broke, and she looked down at Lily, her fingers brushing the child's hair. Before she what? Daniel pressed, leaning forward. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Before she died," she said. 2 years ago. She told me to find you. Said you'd know what to do." The words landed like a stone in his chest. Sarah was gone. The woman he'd loved, hated, mourned, and buried in his heart was gone. And she'd left behind a daughter, his daughter, who now sat across from him, holding a child of her own. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to deny it, to push it all away, but the locket in his hand, the photograph, the weight of Clara's gaze, they were real. Too real. "I need time," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to figure this out." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. I had to find you." The diner fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Daniel looked at Clara, at Lily, at the locket still clutched in his hand. He didn't know what to believe, not yet. But as he watched her, a memory flickered, a rainy night, a woman's laughter, a promise he hadn't kept. 6 years ago, he thought, his mind racing. 6 years ago, he'd met someone, hadn't he? A woman in the rain, a fleeting moment he dismissed as nothing. Could it have been Sarah? Could it have been Clara? The questions swirled, unanswered, pulling him deeper into a past he wasn't sure he wanted to face. But for now, he had her here, in his diner, in his life. And he couldn't let her walk back into the storm. 6 years ago, the city was a different beast, its pulse wilder, its nights sharper. Daniel was 32, a man still clawing his way through the wreckage of a broken marriage, his diner a fledgling dream that barely paid the bills. Ethan was 4, a bright-eyed boy who asked for his mother every night, not understanding why she'd vanished. Daniel didn't have answers then, just a gnawing ache where love used to be. The rain was falling that evening too, a restless downpour that drove most people indoors. He'd been locking up the diner, the neon sign flickering as it powered down, when he saw her, a woman standing under the awning across the street, her silhouette blurred by the storm. She wasn't begging, wasn't crying, but something about her stillness, her quiet defiance against the rain, caught him. He didn't know why he crossed the street. Maybe it was the exhaustion of his own loneliness, maybe it was the way she clutched a thin scarf around her shoulders, as if it could hold her together. "You okay?" he called out, his voice half swallowed by the wind. She turned, and even in the dim light, her eyes struck him, fierce, guarded, but with a flicker of something softer, like a flame struggling to stay lit. She didn't answer right away, just studied him, her lips pressed tight. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 20, her dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. "You'll freeze out here," he said, gesturing toward the diner. "Come in. I've got coffee." She hesitated, her gaze darting to the street as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. But then she nodded, a small, reluctant movement, and followed him inside. The diner was warm, its air heavy with the scent of grease and stale coffee. Daniel flicked on a single light, enough to see her clearly now. Her face was sharp, all angles and defiance, but there was a weariness there too, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. He poured her coffee, slid a plate of leftover pie across the counter. "It's not much," he said, "but it's warm." She took the mug, her fingers trembling slightly, and murmured a thank you so soft he almost missed it. They didn't talk much at first. He busied himself wiping down the counter, giving her space, but his eyes kept drifting to her, her careful movements, the way she broke the pie into tiny pieces before eating, as if savoring it might make it last. "What's your name?" he asked finally, leaning against the counter. She paused, her fork hovering over the plate. "Clara," she said, the word slipping out like a secret. He nodded, testing the name in his mind. "I'm Daniel." She gave a small smile, the first crack in her armor, and it did something to him, stirred a warmth he hadn't felt in years. They talked then, haltingly at first, about the rain, the city, the way the night seemed to stretch on forever. She didn't say much about herself, only that she was passing through, that she'd come from a small town he'd never heard of. But there was a weight to her words, a story she wasn't telling, and he didn't push. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew what it was to guard your scars. The rain didn't let up, and the hours slipped by, the diner a quiet bubble against the storm outside. At some point, he found himself telling her about Ethan, how his son loved drawing, how he'd once tried to cook pancakes and nearly set the kitchen on fire. Clara laughed, a soft, unguarded sound that made the room feel less empty. "He sounds like a good kid," she said, her eyes distant, like she was seeing something beyond the diner walls. "He is," Daniel replied, his voice thick with a pride he rarely let show. He didn't know why he was opening up to her, a stranger, but her presence felt like a tether, something real in a life that had started to feel like a dream. She finished the pie, the coffee long gone, and he noticed her scarf had slipped, revealing a small locket around her neck. It was tarnished, unremarkable, but the way her fingers brushed it, almost instinctively, made him pause. "That's nice," he said, nodding toward it. Her hand froze, and for a moment, her eyes darkened, like he'd touched something forbidden. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to ask more, but the moment passed, and she stood, pulling her scarf tight. "I should go," she said, glancing at the window where the rain had slowed to a drizzle. "You sure?" he asked, a strange urgency in his chest. "It's still bad out there." She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might stay. But then she shook her head. "I'll be fine." He walked her to the door, the silence between them heavy now, charged with something he couldn't name. As she stepped outside, she turned back, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she said, and there was a weight to it, like she was thanking him for more than the coffee or the shelter. He nodded, at a loss for words, and then she was gone, swallowed by the night. He stood there longer than he should have, the door still open, the cold seeping in. Her name, Clara, lingered in his mind, along with the image of her locket, her smile, the way she'd looked at him like she knew him. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment, a kindness offered and accepted. But as he locked up and headed home to Ethan, a part of him felt like he'd left something behind. The next day, he found himself scanning the street outside the diner, half expecting to see her again. She didn't come. Not that week, not the next. Life moved on, the grind of bills and parenthood pulling him back into its rhythm. But sometimes, late at night when the diner was quiet, he'd remember her voice, her eyes, the locket. He'd wonder where she'd gone, if she was safe, if she'd found whatever she was looking for. He didn't know why it mattered so much, why a single night had carved itself so deeply into him. Maybe it was because she'd seen him, really seen him, in a way no one had since Sarah left. Or maybe it was something else, something he couldn't yet grasp. 6 years later, sitting across from Clara in that same diner, her locket glinting under the fluorescent lights, Daniel felt the past rush back like a flood. The woman in the rain, the one he'd let walk away, was here now, claiming a truth he couldn't fathom. Her daughter, Lily, slept in her arms, and the photograph she'd shown him, the one of him and Sarah, burned in his memory. He wanted to ask her about that night, to see if she remembered it the way he did. But her words, her claim that he was her father, hung between them like a blade. If she was telling the truth, then everything he thought he knew about his life was a lie. And if she wasn't, then why did her presence feel like a missing piece slotting into place? The rain outside had stopped, but the storm inside him was just beginning. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the checkered floor as Daniel sat alone, the locket still clutched in his hand. Clara had left hours ago, her footsteps fading into the night, taking Lily with her. She'd refused his offer to stay, her eyes guarded, her voice firm but brittle. "I didn't come here to beg," she'd said, and before he could argue, she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her. Now, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of rain from the awning outside. The locket's weight felt heavier than it should, its tarnished surface a mirror to memories he'd buried long ago. Sarah's face stared back at him from the tiny photo inside, her smile a ghost that stirred both love and betrayal. Could Clara be telling the truth? Could she really be his daughter? He turned the locket over, his fingers tracing the faint engraving on the back, a date, barely legible, May 15, 2003. 22 years ago. His mind churned, piecing together fragments of a life he'd tried to forget. He'd been 26 then, reckless, caught in a whirlwind romance with Sarah. They'd met at a bar, her laughter cutting through the noise like a beacon. She'd been vibrant, unpredictable, a force that pulled him in and held him captive. Their relationship had been a storm, passionate, chaotic, and doomed from the start. They'd fought as fiercely as they'd loved, and when she left him, just before Ethan was born, she'd taken a piece of him with her. He'd never known why she left, only that she did, without a word, leaving him to raise their son alone. But a daughter? The math fit, but the idea felt like a betrayal of everything he'd believed. Daniel's hands shook as he set the locket down, his eyes drifting to the crumpled photograph Clara had left behind. It was him, unmistakably, younger, softer, his arm around a woman whose face was torn away. He didn't need to see it to know it was Sarah. The memory was there, faint but sharp, a snapshot of a night he'd pushed to the edges of his mind. They'd been at a carnival, the air thick with the smell of cotton candy and diesel. She'd insisted on the photo booth, laughing as they crammed inside, her head on his shoulder. He'd kept the picture for years, tucked in a box with other relics of their life together. But how had Clara gotten it? And why now, after all these years? He stood, pacing the diner, his boots scuffing the worn floor. The questions were relentless, each one slicing deeper. If Clara was his daughter, why hadn't Sarah told him? Had she known she was pregnant when she left? And if she had, why keep it a secret? The thought made his chest tighten, a mix of anger and guilt coiling inside him. He'd been a mess back then, drinking too much, working odd jobs, barely holding it together. Maybe Sarah hadn't trusted him to be a father. Maybe she'd been right. But the idea that she'd raised Clara alone, that she'd died without telling him, felt like a wound reopening. He needed answers, and Clara was the only one who could give them. The next morning, Daniel barely slept, his eyes gritty as he opened the diner. Ethan was at school, oblivious to the storm brewing in his father's life. Daniel moved through the motions, flipping pancakes, pouring coffee, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Clara's words, her face, the locket. He tried calling the shelter she'd mentioned, but they had no record of her. She'd vanished as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving him with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He locked the diner, drove to the alley where he'd found her, hoping for some trace, a clue, anything. The alley was empty, the pavement still damp from the rain, the dumpster looming like a silent witness. He stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, and felt the weight of his own ignorance. She'd been here, starving, freezing, and he'd let her walk away. Back at the diner, he pulled out the box he kept under the counter, a battered metal thing filled with pieces of his past. Letters, photos, Ethan's old drawings. He hadn't opened it in years, but now he tore through it, searching for anything that might connect to Clara. Near the bottom, he found it, a second copy of the carnival photo, the one Clara had shown him. This one was intact, Sarah's face clear and bright, her eyes sparkling with a joy he hadn't seen in years. His throat tightened as he stared at her, the memories flooding back. But there was something else in the box, something he'd forgotten, a small, folded note, tucked inside an envelope with no address. He unfolded it, his hands unsteady, and read the words written in Sarah's looping script, "If you ever find her, tell her I'm sorry." The note hit him like a punch. Find her. Sarah had known. She'd known about Clara, had left this note as a confession, a plea. But why hadn't she told him? Why leave him in the dark? His vision blurred, tears he hadn't shed in years burning his eyes. He slammed his fist on the counter, the sound echoing in the empty diner. "Damn it, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" The anger surged, hot and raw, but beneath it was something heavier, grief, for the years lost, for the daughter he hadn't known, for the life they might have had. He clutched the note, his fingers crumpling the edges, and made a decision. He had to find Clara. He had to know the truth. He started with the locket's date, May 15, 2003. It was a long shot, but he called an old friend, a private investigator named Mike who owed him a favor. "I need you to look into something," Daniel said, his voice tight. "A birth record, around May 2003. Mother's name is Sarah Bennett. Father, might be me." Mike didn't ask questions, just promised to dig. While he waited, Daniel drove to the hospital where Sarah had worked briefly before they married. The records department was a dead end, too much time had passed, too many privacy laws. But a nurse, an older woman with kind eyes, remembered Sarah. "She was here for a while," the nurse said, her voice soft. "Came in alone a lot, toward the end of her pregnancy. Never said who the father was." The words landed like stones. Sarah had been pregnant, alone, while he'd been drowning in his own chaos. He thanked the nurse, his voice hollow, and drove back to the diner, the note still in his pocket. That night, Mike called. "Found something," he said. "Birth certificate, May 16, 2003. Girl named Clara Bennett. Mother's name is Sarah. Father's name, it's listed as unknown." Daniel's heart sank, but Mike wasn't done. "There's more. Sarah filed a custody form a year later, naming you as the father, but it was never processed. Looks like she changed her mind." Daniel hung up, his hands shaking. It was true. Clara was his daughter. The realization was a tidal wave, sweeping away the last of his doubts. He saw her face again, her eyes so like Sarah's, her quiet strength. He'd failed her, just as he'd failed Sarah. But she was out there, somewhere, with a child of her own, and he couldn't fail her again. He grabbed his coat, the note still in his pocket, and headed into the night, determined to find her, no matter how long it took. The city was quiet under the weight of dusk, its streets bathed in the soft gold of fading light. Daniel stood at the edge of a small park, his breath catching as he watched the world slow around him. For weeks, he'd searched for Clara, every shelter, every alley, every corner of the city that might hold a trace of her. The note from Sarah, crumpled and worn, stayed in his pocket, a silent reminder of the years he'd lost. He'd called in every favor, checked every lead, but she'd slipped through his fingers like rain. Yet he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he knew she was his daughter, not when the ache of her absence grew sharper with each passing day. Ethan had started asking questions, his 10-year-old eyes too perceptive, but Daniel had no answers to give. All he had was a stubborn hope, fragile but unyielding, that he'd find her. The park was modest, a patch of green tucked between gray buildings, its benches worn and its swings creaking in the breeze. Daniel came here often, drawn by a hunch he couldn't explain. Clara had mentioned a place like this once, in the diner, her voice soft as she described a park where she'd take Lily to watch the birds. He scanned the faces now, mothers pushing strollers, kids chasing each other, an old man feeding pigeons. No Clara. No Lily. He was about to turn away when he saw her, sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the park, her dark hair catching the last of the sunlight. She was reading, a tattered book open on her lap, while Lily played nearby, stacking pebbles into wobbly towers. Daniel's heart lurched. It was her. After all this time, it was her. He didn't move right away. He stood there, rooted, watching the way Clara's fingers turned the pages, the way she glanced at Lily every few seconds, her face soft with a love that made his chest ache. She looked different now, less gaunt, her clothes cleaner, though still threadbare. Someone had helped her, maybe a shelter, maybe a kind stranger. The thought gave him a flicker of relief, but it didn't ease the guilt that had settled in his bones. He'd let her walk away that night in the diner, too stunned to stop her, too afraid to face the truth. Now, standing here, he felt the weight of every missed chance, every year he hadn't known her. Lily's laughter broke his trance, a bright, unguarded sound that carried across the park. The little girl stood, her tiny hands clutching a pebble, and toddled toward the bench. But her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, her pebble rolling away. Daniel moved before he could think, crossing the distance in a few quick strides. He knelt beside her, steadying her with a gentle hand. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice soft. Lily looked up, her brown eyes wide and curious, so like his own that it stole his breath. "My rock," she said, pointing to the pebble. He picked it up, brushing off the dirt, and placed it in her palm. "There you go," he said, smiling despite the knot in his throat. "Chew?" Lily asked, tilting her head. "You look like me." The words were so simple, so innocent, but they hit him like a wave, pulling him under. He opened his mouth to answer, but Clara's shadow fell over them, her book forgotten on the bench. "Lily," she said, her voice sharp with worry, then softer as she saw him. "Daniel." His name on her lips was a question, a challenge, a memory. He stood slowly, his hands unsteady, and met her gaze. Her eyes were guarded, but there was no anger there, only a weary resignation, as if she'd known this moment would come. "I've been looking for you," he said, the words spilling out, raw and unpolished. "Every day, Clara. I couldn't stop." She didn't respond right away, just scooped Lily into her arms, holding her close. The locket glinted at her throat, a silent link to the past they shared. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice low, almost lost in the breeze. "Why now?" He took a step closer, careful not to crowd her, his hands open at his sides. "Because I know," he said. "I know you're my daughter. I know I failed you. And I can't live with that unless I try to make it right." Her expression flickered, a crack in her armor, but she didn't look away. "You didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "She didn't tell you." "I didn't expect you to." She stopped, her eyes glistening, and Daniel felt the urge to reach for her, to pull her close, but he held back. "I should have known," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have looked for you. For her. I let her go, and I lost you both." The confession hung between them, heavy and unguarded, and for a moment, the park faded away, leaving only the two of them and the years they'd never reclaim. Clara set Lily down, letting her return to her pebbles, and took a step toward him. "She loved you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Even when she left, she loved you. She kept that picture, the locket, your name. She wanted me to find you, not to hurt you, but to know you." Daniel's throat tightened, the weight of Sarah's choices settling over him. He'd hated her for leaving, for abandoning Ethan, but now he saw the cost she'd paid, raising Clara alone, carrying a secret that broke her. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but all he had. "For her. For you. For everything." Clara's eyes softened, just for a moment, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the crumpled photograph she'd shown him in the diner. "This was all I had of you," she said. "For years, it was just this. And then I found you, and I didn't know what to do. I was angry, scared. But I'm not anymore." She handed him the photo, her fingers brushing his, and the touch was a spark, a connection that felt like coming home. He looked at the image, himself, Sarah, a moment frozen in time, and saw not just the past, but the future they could still build. "I don't know how to be your father," he said, his voice raw. "I don't know if you even want that. But I want to try. For you, for Lily, for Ethan. If you'll let me." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at Lily, then back at him, her eyes searching his face. The park was quiet now, the other families gone, the sky deepening to twilight. Finally, she nodded, a small, hesitant movement, and reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady, and in that touch, Daniel felt the first stirrings of forgiveness, of hope. They stood there, hand in hand, as Lily ran back to them, her laughter filling the air. The photograph, the locket, the note, they were pieces of a story that had brought them here, to this moment, to this park. Daniel didn't know what came next, but as he looked at Clara, at the daughter he'd never known, he knew he'd spend the rest of his life making up for lost time. The rain had stopped, the storm had passed, and in its place was something new, a family, fragile but real, ready to begin again.